all of us have come across this statement: nothing is impossible to God. God is able to do anything and everything they so wish. Um, Maimonides then goes ahead to make an argument about this that can be very controversial. He basically makes the argument that there are things that are impossible for God to do. Um, yeah, so that can be very controversial because all of us have grown, especially if you grew up in religion, being told that nothing is impossible before God. God can do anything they so wish to do. This is what Maimonides says. He says, "We have thus shown that according to each one of the different theories, there are things which are impossible, whose existence cannot be admitted, and whose creation is excluded from the power of God. And the assumption that God does not change their nature does not imply weakness in God or a limit to his power." So he says, he basically arguing that there are things that are impossible even to God, but that does not mean that God is weak or limited, which is kind of a very difficult argument, I guess, I think, to make or to understand. It is impossible that God should produce a being like himself. Now he's giving example. Or annihilate, or corporify, or change himself. So that's one of the examples he gives of things that God cannot do. God cannot create another God. That's according to him. Maybe somebody else might argue otherwise. Maybe it's possible God to create another God. Even though there is another part of the book where he argues, where he was arguing about the God being one or unity, like we have one God, and he was arguing, making a logical argument of why that conclusion, that if there are two gods, then it means if the two gods are needed, then it means they are not really gods. And then there are questions of, because the universe behaves like like the universe has no conflict in itself. It's so in tandem with itself, which means that it must be controlled by a single force, basically, so that it is in that kind of harmony. That he was making those arguments. So what he's saying here, that as an example of something that he argues that is impossible for God to do, is to create another God, or to annihilate God himself, or to make himself corporeal, which some people can argue against this, and their arguments can be very logical. For example, people have argued that Jesus Christ was a corporeal representation of God. So there's that. Another thing is God cannot change himself. So those are some of the things he gives as an example. He then says, again, whilst philosophers says that it is impossible to produce a square with a diagonal equal to one of the sides, or a solid angle that includes four right angles, or similar things, it is thought possible by some person who are ignorant of mathematics and who only know the words of this proposition but have no idea of that which is expressed by them. So the other category of things that he says are impossible for God is to go against scientific laws, and here he gives examples of mathematical laws. For example, having, like, it is impossible to produce a square with a diagonal equal to one of the sides. If you have a square, then it's totally impossible even for God to have a square that has a diagonal that is equal to one of the sides. He also says, or a solid angle that includes four right angles. It is impossible even for God. And he says there are people who think it's possible, but he calls them ignorant of mathematics. So yeah, so this is controversial. I think it must be, especially for anyone who is, especially for people who are religious and believe and take to heart the statement that there is nothing impossible to God.